I think someone fixed that for me. Okay, so we've got a very interesting topic for today, which is translanguaging. And like you, I am very excited to know more on this topic. And before we move on, I just want to give you a brief overview of the session. So this webinar today will cover if English language teachers should be using another language in the classroom, and more so about experience from our two ELT experts, Christopher Graham and Helena Stekunis, and they will discuss their experience and share their thoughts on the subject of translanguaging. You'll also have the opportunity to ask questions at the end of the session, so we are making a note of that. During the session, you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A box. And we'll make a record of this and cover it towards the end. If you have any comments, you can obviously use the chat box. I do have an announcement to make. Unfortunately, Dr. Sabria could not join us today for the session. So you will be missed, Dr. Sabria, for this session. And I'm sorry for our audience because I know you were expecting to see her, but unfortunately, she's not able to join us today for the session. Moving on, my name is Sarah Shuja. I'm a marketing manager at McGraw Hill, and I'm joined by my colleague Fatma Al Ibrahim, and we are your moderators for today. So we will be supporting you in the session. If you have any questions, you can let us know. If you're facing any technical difficulties, please let us know, and we're happy to help you out during the session. Use the chat box as much as you can. We want to keep this interactive, keep your comments coming in. And like I said, if you have any questions for us, you can pop them in the Q&A box and we can cover it towards the end of the session. I now would like to officially introduce our ELT experts. So that I have Christopher Graham with me. Thank you, Christopher, for being here. Can you tell us a bit about yourself, please?
I can.
Yes,
yeah.
Thank
you for having me. Certainly. So greetings from Scotland, which is where I'm sitting. And I was saying earlier to my colleagues last night it was -10, but it's now quite a warm -7 apparently. So hence the scarf. As you can see from the slide there, I've been working in English language teaching for probably too many years, a very long time now, as a teacher educator, researcher, and a writer. My most recent work in the last 2.5 years or so has been with the British Council around the topic of climate, around the interaction between climate change, the climate crisis in English language teaching, looking at how we can integrate key topics around the climate emergency into our classes, and how, as a global community, we can reduce our carbon footprint and reduce our impact on the environment. So I've been working on that, and I'm also at the moment working on a project with the British Council in Southeast Asia, looking at the provision of online professional development in 6 Southeast Asian countries. So that's me.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much for being here and giving your time to us. Honestly, it's much appreciated. Helena, can you please introduce yourself and tell us more about what you do?
Yeah, okay, so thanks also for having me. So my name is Helena Stekunis. I am joining you today from a very small village in southwest France, where I live with my family. But I work online for Durham University in the north of England, where I work on the MA TESOL and Applied Linguistics program, teaching subjects such as sociolinguistics, intercultural communication and education, and technology-enhanced language education. And I'm also just in the process of completing my PhD at Lancaster University, where I did a study into the role of language and how language impacts the student experience at the internationalized university. I have been an English teacher since I was 20, traveling around different countries. And I also had a school in Manchester where I welcomed students from all around the world to try and integrate them into the local community. And we became like a multicultural, multilingual, multinational family there in Manchester. So I'm happy to join you today and excited to talk about this topic that's very important. Thank you, Sarish.
Thank you, Helena. That was a wonderful introduction. Thank you so much. And thank you for your time as well for being here at the session. I can at this point stop sharing my screen unless anyone has any questions for me. I do want to remind you that the session is being recorded, so you will have the recording of the session. And like I said, feel free to drop any questions in the Q&A box. And I think that's enough from me for today. So I'll stop sharing my screen at this point. Thank you. Over to you, Helena.
Okay, so thank you, Sarish. And in the spirit of translanguaging, shukran. Thank you very much for having me here today. And I'm really honored to share this platform with Chris Graham as well. So let's move on now to our topic for today. I'm going to talk briefly about how we might go about defining translanguaging, what it is, what they say in the literature. Then I'll talk about how I see translanguaging as a natural phenomenon, not something that we can ignore. And then think about how we move forward in our classrooms, thinking about research. So when I was preparing for this session, I turned to the literature. It's what I do at the university. So I discovered that translanguaging as a concept actually began in Wales, which is the small country attached to England, where in Wales, they speak Welsh and English, and Welsh has had something of a comeback in recent years. It's become a language recognized by the government and employed within education also. So it was described, translanguaging came about to describe the movement between Welsh and English languages of the people living in Wales. More recently, translanguaging has expanded to mean many more things to many more people, and it's very difficult to define it actually. Professor Li Wei and Ofelia Garcia are two of the biggest names when it comes to translanguaging. And they recently wrote a paper, which I've referenced for you on a handout, which hopefully Sarish can put in the chat for you all. And they explained that translanguaging nowadays is seen as kind of three different things. The first is the natural movement between languages in people's everyday conversations. This is for those of us who are bilingual or multilingual. It's the natural use in our everyday conversations, moving between different languages, using different words inserted into our sentences from our different linguistic repertoires. The second, and that's referred to as universal translanguaging. The second perception of translanguaging is classroom translanguaging, which is something we might be more interested in today. And this is the pedagogical approach of using learners' first or second or the different linguistic repertoires they have, as well as the target language within the classroom. It's when teachers and students make the conscious decision to draw on their different linguistic repertoires to communicate and complete tasks in the classroom. So classroom translanguaging. The third is more recent, and it's neuro-linguistic translanguaging. And this is more concerned with the research that's being done into the psychology, the process of moving between different languages within our mind and the different research that's being done. So translanguaging is a complex concept, and that's acknowledged in the literature. It's difficult to define. Some people mix it up with the notion of code switching, which for me is something slightly different. Code switching is the conscious decision to try and use a different language or a different register of language or a different level of formality of language in order to fit in. We do this within our own languages, perhaps every day. When we're speaking to somebody more formal, we change our language. When we're speaking about a certain subject, let's say science, we change our vocabulary. And so we all actually code switch in our everyday lives to fit whoever we're speaking to. I particularly like Khawla Badwan, who is a researcher at Manchester Metropolitan University. She talks about this notion of languaging, and she actually argues that we don't need to use the trans at the start of the term, because she explains that we are all languaging every day within our named language. If we take Arabic, for example, I know in many schools in Arabic-speaking countries that you use modern standard Arabic, and that is often the form of Arabic that's expected to be used. But in reality, the students are often using different forms of Arabic. Khawla Badwan talks about in Tunisia, the children using different regional versions of Arabic in the classroom because that's what they're used to using. We all language every day. And so I have included on my handout a picture from my son's letter to Father Christmas. And you may know that some families, well, here in France now we're preparing for Christmas, and we encourage our children to write a letter to Father Christmas. And most recently, my daughter, she wrote her letter, but my son, who's 7, had not written his letter, and we couldn't understand why. And we kept asking him, why have you not written your letter to Father Christmas yet? He won't bring you any presents if you don't. And it turned out that he was worried about writing his letter to Father Christmas because he didn't know how to in English. My daughter had written her letter in English, but my son at school learns in French and in Occitan, which is the regional language. He doesn't have the habit of writing in English, and so he was really stressed out and really worried about writing this letter. So we said, of course you can write your letter in French. Father Christmas understands all languages. So he wrote his letter. But if you can make out from his writing on the picture, he actually wrote in a mixture of French and English. And this kind of proves Khawla Badwan's point, the fact that we naturally will draw on whichever languages we have in order to communicate. We draw on a range of linguistic repertoires in order to get our message across. And that doesn't necessarily just come from one language or one form of language, one variety. Yesterday I was in the shops and I heard 2 ladies in front of me talking in Arabic. And I understand a few words of Arabic, but not a lot. But I could understand that they were dropping in French words every now and again, and I could tune into the French words because I could understand them. And they were talking about the high school, and they were talking about the doctor's surgery. And they were using the French words each time they did talk about things in France, in the culture here. And it was really interesting to hear them switch naturally between the 2 languages to communicate. It's a natural phenomenon. It's something we do every day. I went to my daughter's flamenco class last night dancing, and the teacher there was half French, half Spanish, and she was trying to teach the children some Spanish words. So naturally, she was moving between French and Spanish, using the two. When I had my language school in Manchester, I had a majority of students from the Middle East who naturally spoke in Arabic in our English class. I also had a large group of Spanish speakers who naturally spoke in Spanish in our English class. And at the time, it really worried me because we had learned from communicative language teaching principles that people learn English through using English, and that we should encourage our learners to always be speaking in English. And so I tried different strategies to stop them using their first language, but it was no use because it's a natural phenomenon. Everybody draws on their linguistic repertoires to communicate, as did my students. So that's where I'll come to a conclusion in my little speech now, is to say that translanguaging is something that happens. It's not necessarily something that we can stop, but of course, we probably need more research into understanding how it happens, what are the impacts here. And I'll hand over to Chris.
Lovely. Thanks so much, Elaine. There's lots to think about there, and to agree with as well, you'll be glad to hear when we come to discussions. I suppose the translanguaging thing came to me almost ideologically. My interest in it was almost ideological. As I mentioned, I've been involved in English language teaching all my life, which is a ridiculously long time. And for many years, as I've been in the profession, I've observed the discussion about native speakerism, about non-native speaking teachers. I hate the term non-native speaking teachers, but it's kind of become the term, so I'll use it anyway for want of a better way of describing the phenomenon where a teacher who did not grow up in an English-speaking environment is an English teacher. And I've watched this, and it always seems strange to me that a teacher who maybe French, for example, or German, who studied English for 4 or 5 years at university and many years prior to that at school, should be considered somehow inferior to a teacher who simply happened to be born in Manchester or London or New York. And that for many years has been the case. So my kind of moving into translanguaging was ideological, because I always felt this is not reasonable to somehow segregate, somehow discriminate against teachers who are not native speakers. But when you think about it a little bit more and drill down into more detail, you begin to think, well, surely even more, the fact that a French-speaking English language teacher speaks French makes them a much more effective teacher of French students. They can anticipate problems, whether through interference or just complexity of grammar or comparisons between the language. They will know the students are going to have these problems before the students have them. It's such an asset. And my first teaching job was in Italy. I was in Italy for about 4.5 years, and kind of maybe a year or 18 months into my stay in Italy, my Italian became reasonably competent. And I found that I was also able to anticipate, I know what they're doing, because I remember when I did this. Yeah, okay, I'll reverse it and I'll be able to support them. And yet the language school I was working in, a private language school, if they knew that any of this was going on in Italian, they probably might have lost their jobs. I don't know, because the policy of the school was English only. But when you actually stop and think about it, first of all, as Helena said, the students do it anyway. Anyone, when learning a language, will use as a reference point their home language. Is a perfectly normal thing to do. It's more than normal. It's almost essential, in my opinion, to quickly think, okay, that's how it is. So if we build on that, and a teacher who speaks the first language, whether someone who's learned it or more likely someone born into that language, says, I know what you're thinking. It's not like that. It's like this, because I remember that. It's not, got it. That is such a wonderful way to support learners, I think, to be able to anticipate problems, and maybe in one sentence, maybe sometimes in 3 words, to say, no, it's not like that, it's like this. Okay, back to English. And the back to English bit is important. The delineation, I think, the way that we use the first language. There is always a risk that certain students will think, okay, we can do all of this in French, or we can do all of this in Arabic. I quite like this English lesson. So delineation, saying, I'm going to use French, Arabic, first language, whatever it is, to talk about, to help you with grammar problems, to make comparisons, sometimes for word-on-word vocabulary, where there's just a simple vocabulary explanation, a simple equivalence, but not for other things. So I think having a grown-up conversation with learners is important. And towards the end of my time in Italy, I actually became director of the school, ridiculously over-promoted for my age, but there I was. And I introduced this policy of what I called a 0 lesson. And the 0 lesson was the beginning of every lesson, particularly the lessons for the lower level students, are kind of A1, A2 students who didn't have very much English. The first part of the first lesson would be in Italian, and it would explain how it was going to be, what experiences they were going to have, effectively how we were going to teach them. And then I'd also explain when teachers might use Italian, when they shouldn't use Italian, when learners could use Italian, when perhaps they shouldn't. And I think that delineation is very, very important. And having adult conversations, I'm not suggesting that with primary learners, but with teenagers onwards, you can have these conversations and say, look, that's okay. If you're really worried, I'll have a quick chat with you in Italian and I can clear this up very quickly. So it is such a wonderful teaching tool. Absolutely it is. And I think it's not just optional. For me, it's almost obligatory that it should be used by teachers. I would encourage teachers to use the first language more. That's probably quite a controversial thing to say. And we're going to look at a little bit later on. I want to look at resistance and issues around it. But it's a great tool. Don't be afraid to use it, even if you have to do it with the door locked and hope the school director doesn't find out about you or supervisor doesn't hear you. They're probably doing it as well in their classes. And certainly their students are. So we're only responding to what students want. And of course, many language learners are translanguages themselves. I mean, I notice there's quite a few people here from Lebanon. I've worked in Beirut on and off for some years, and Lebanese are the world's best translanguages. I swear I've heard sentences start in French, Arabic in the middle, English at the end, just in one sentence. You're just masters of it. I'm not sure how they switch from one to the other, what their rationale is. My theory is it probably isn't a rationale. They just have 3 languages to hand, so they just use them. But the Lebanese are masters of it. So many students are doing it anyway. So it's not a great problem to encourage them to do it. The next thing I'd like to think about with climate change, with translanguaging, is the work that I've done on climate change. I've been working, as I said, with the British Council on climate change, that interaction between climate change and English language teaching for a while now. And one of the challenges about bringing climate change into the classroom is the complexity of the topics. Climate science is complex in your own language, but if you add on top of that the overlay of another language that you may only be operating at A2, B1 level, it's almost impossible to talk about the complexities of climate science. And I'm talking here whether it's primary all the way up to university level students in some cases. Translanguaging works very well where learners can be encouraged to read the text in their own language around a climate topic, around the science of climate change. Text suitable for their age rather than their language level, because they're learning in their own language. And then to take the content, the ideas, the concepts, and then if you wish, the output, which could be a poster, could be a discussion, could be a presentation, would be in English. And that seems to me a really good way to manage complexity of texts in English that would be out of reach of many learners. So that's a nice example, I think, of translanguaging in class. And I think in CLIL classes where concepts are taught in English, some translanguaging can help again to deal with complex concepts that you want to introduce. But that brings me to my last area that I want to look at, which is resistance. as I said before, when I first started off in the school in Italy, wasn't a great idea to be using Italian in class, because it was an English only school, because that's how we were going to learn, by using only English, which was actually not what was happening, but that's how the school presented itself. There is resistance from parents, resistance from other teachers, resistance from ministries of education. A lot of that resistance, I think, is based upon lack of understanding, not actually knowing what is involved, why we do it. So I suppose I'd say explanation and exemplification are two of the ways of managing it. Actually going through the process, saying, look, this is why we're doing it. These are the advantages that it brings your learners. This is why it's so important. On top of that, exemplification. Here's an example. Look, a 2-minute explanation of a grammar point will help that learner to understand a piece of grammar, to a simple vocabulary explanation. And I think that can help deal with the problem. But there is resistance, and teachers I've spoken to say, well, I can't do that. Well, you probably can do it anyway, but just beginning a kind of an educational process to help people understand why it's important, I think, is the way forwards. So that's what I wanted to say. So we should have a little bit of time. We have a little bit of time for some questions, I think, now. Though, Helena, maybe you want to challenge me on anything I've said, or agree with me even better.
Yeah, I do agree with you, and I was interested to hear your approaches there. I think you're kind of advocating for a very open approach to the fact that translanguaging is natural and will happen, and that it can be helpful. And I think those are perhaps more the conversations that we need to be having with parents who have paid for their children to be in an English as a medium of instruction school. We need to probably explain that by denying learners the opportunity to use their first language, we might actually be denying them as people, because language is an important part of our identity. And by telling somebody that they can't draw on their identity, on everything that they've known up until that point, it's kind of denying the learners themselves. I think we often forget that learners come to our classrooms with a head full of, and a heart full of experiences, knowledge, and there's lots of learning theories that show we should always be drawing on learners' schemata, on their background knowledge. That's how we activate their interest, their motivation, and how we get them learning is to make them, help them to make connections between what they already knew and what they're learning in the classroom. So in light of that, it makes sense for them to use their first language, because they're drawing on and making those connections between their background knowledge and the new knowledge. But I do understand people's reservations around it, because I don't know if you experienced this, Chris, but when we were trained to be TEFL teachers on the it was like, no, you must not use the first language. Did you have the same?
Yeah, no, do they still do that?
I don't know, to be honest.
I have a feeling certain courses might. I mean, a long time ago since I have received any kind of teacher education, but I have a horrible feeling that that's still the case. It's something you can't do, and certainly I know many ministries of education around the world wouldn't consider it at all acceptable that primary or secondary teachers use the first language at all. So I mean, resistance, it's a real problem. But I do actually believe explanation, because if you sit down and explain it, it is actually quite clear, quite logical.
Yeah.
And also what you say about almost it almost denigrates the first language, saying it's not acceptable. Our language is so connected to our culture, to our, it's somewhere in here, wherever these things are kept, isn't it? And it's almost an attack on the first language, saying, no, it's not. Don't use that thing. Don't use this, only this. And when you actually sit down and think about it, that's actually quite a negative thing to do, isn't it? There's so many sensitivities around language. So I think we need to challenge it, same as way that we need to challenge native speakerism. But it though there is plenty of research to do, isn't there always? I don't think the arguments are difficult to make. You're just challenging orthodoxy, which is in itself difficult. I think people just perhaps resistant to change, whatever that change is.
Yeah, sure. Although I do understand the reservations around it. And actually on the handout, I've put a link to a webinar I saw by Professor Victoria Murphy at Oxford University. And she was explaining, as we have today, that it's a natural phenomenon, translanguaging will happen, but that perhaps we need to exercise a little bit of caution before adopting it as a policy in schools, because there hasn't been a lot of research done on how translanguaging helps the language learning process. There's the logic, as we've talked about, it makes sense, but there isn't yet a great deal of research that's been done to kind of prove that translanguaging can be effective in helping language learning processes. So, there's still more to be done, but she explains that actually getting into schools and doing research on this is very challenging, because teachers, as we all know here today, have so much work to do anyway. To then have researchers in the classroom and to get permission to conduct research in the classroom is challenging. So I think there's still a long way to go before we can have that evidence kind of there to really back up what we're saying.
I agree, but I suppose that my response to that is I agree completely, but we all know. In a sense, teachers are doing that research because we all know that we all hear the whispering in Arabic in the back. And think, is that, what does he mean? Oh, I know. Is it? Oh no, it's not like that. Was it ing? Oh, it's got ing. I know what that is. Yeah, I think there's that magic moment when two or three learners talk about an English grammar point in their own language, because I think they're actually really learning something then. I think teachers know that, but you're right, it's going to be a while before there's any documentary evidence, because teachers don't want to admit to doing it properly. So they don't want people coming into their class saying, oh no, I never did that. So I think that's going to be the challenge, to get people to say, yeah, we do that and it works. Though I suppose private sector schools may be slightly different, whether they're outside of the remit of ministries of education and that kind of thing. What about in university settings in the UK? I mean, what happens there? I know many of the groups are multilingual, so it's a bit more complicated.
Yeah, so this was my research, my PhD research. I spent a year sitting in university seminars, lectures, and conducting interviews with students from all different places, from the UK and from abroad, who had a range of linguistic backgrounds. And I went into it just with an open mind, wanting to understand the student experience and not and wanting to understand why students don't always mix across nationalities, across cultures. And my conclusion is language. And it was often language that separated people. And within the classrooms, where of course English was the medium of instruction, students were often sitting in their own linguistic groups. And when the teacher would set activities, they'd automatically go into Mandarin, into Arabic, into Polish, into Russian. There was one class that I sat in for entrepreneurship, and there were literally conversations going on in 7 or 8 different languages. And then the teacher would bring them back and they would then do their main class discussion in English. And
There
actually,
it is. Yeah.
yeah, I kind of felt, because, you know, changing this mindset of coming from, we must always speak in English. I sat there as an EFL teacher feeling a sense of panic. Oh my gosh, everybody's talking in their own languages. And then I saw that it worked, because they'd had the opportunity to talk about quite complex concepts around the readings that they were doing in their own language, which then gave them the confidence to be able to speak about it in front of the class in English. And so it was kind of revelatory for me as well to see that they were using their first languages as a tool, as you mentioned earlier, and it was working well.
Yeah, I mean, they'll always do that, won't they? They group linguistically / culturally sometimes, and whatever you try to do to physically drag them around the classroom to mix and mingle, they will do for that lesson the next time. They'll be back with their linguistic fellows, basically, and that's fine. There's a reason for that, I think, isn't there? Should we think about taking some questions now, Sheris? Do you think? Yeah,
I think yes. We have some great questions that have come in.
Are you going to ask them?
I can go ahead, and you guys
Yeah.
can both pick who wants to answer which one. Okay, so the first one is, what is the difference between code switching and translanguaging?
It's a Helena question.
Okay, so I mean, many people would say nothing. A lot of the literature defines translanguaging and code switching as simultaneously used for the same thing, and it means the movement between different named languages, or the movement between different linguistic repertoires. So many people will use code switching and translanguaging interchangeably. My understanding is they are slightly different. For me, code switching can apply to the change within one named language. So as I was explaining earlier, for example, if I'm speaking English, I have different varieties of English. So maybe when I'm speaking with a certain group of people, my pronunciation, for example, will be more towards a standard English pronunciation. Whereas when I'm with my family, who are from Manchester, my accent will change to be more the accent of Manchester, because we might consciously make that switch to try and fit in with the people around us. It can also change in terms of formality. So when I'm speaking at university, for example, I would speak in a more formal tone, a more formal register than when I'm speaking with my family. So in that sense, I'm code switching within my own named language of English, changing to fit in. Translanguaging I see as something more natural, not something that we necessarily do consciously. It's more of a fluid movement between the different words between different languages and linguistic repertoires in our minds. So, for example, Haula Badouan explained that the children in Tunisia weren't necessarily moving within a sentence between different named languages, because they didn't really know whether the words they had were from English or from Tunisian Arabic or from modern standard Arabic. They were just merging them all in order to communicate their message. So that for me is the difference. Code switching is more of a conscious decision to try and fit in with those around you, whereas translanguaging is something more natural, what happens just like that. But in the literature, you'll find lots of different definitions, and you find your own, basically.
No, thanks, Helena. You've described it really well, actually. Thank you so much. We got another great question, and I like this one. It says, so using different languages in class to teach English won't slow down the process of learning English. Is that right? In other words, do you encourage using the first/mother tongue to teach English language?
I personally don't think it will slow things down, possibly the opposite. Again, the research may be lacking, but and also depends on the level of the students as well. But I think with lower level classes, the use of the first language by the teacher and some use of it amongst the students actually facilitates learning. Particularly when you have lower level students, and within a group of lower level students, anxious students or students who really lacking confidence, sometimes just a few words of reassurance in their own language come in, this is okay, I can do this. So no, I don't think it slows. I think it actually, if anything, it might speed the process up. Using the first language to teach the second language becomes less significant, I suspect, as the levels get higher, because the students have got much more high levels of proficiency in English, so they don't necessarily need that support, but the psychological support might still be needed. But no, personally, as I say, with lower level students and with younger learners, well, primary, I would encourage teachers to make use of the first language. I don't know what you think, Elena.
Yeah, I would agree, but this is what we're talking about earlier, the idea that, you know, logically it makes sense that learners might actually learn English more quickly if they're able to draw on their previous knowledge, if they're able to make those connections and are not denied the opportunities of making those connections. But the fact is, we don't really know. The research isn't yet there to kind of prove our theory. There is research to show that English as a medium of instruction does not necessarily mean improvement in the English language. So there is research to show that using only English as a medium of instruction will necessarily lead to improvement in the English language. What we need to now know is, using the first language, does that lead to a more effective learning process? In theory, yes. But in practice, I think we still need the research. I think maybe, you know, I would encourage people to, if they are allowed and if they have the opportunity to try, you know, and maybe speak to the learners. Ask them, how do they feel if you do certain portions of the lesson, like Chris's example of talking about the grammar at the beginning of the class, or talking about what you're going to do in the first language. Experiment, try it out. You know, you are the ones in charge of the classroom, and then you'll get a feeling for whether it's beneficial for the learners or not.
Absolutely. We also need to define what we mean by using as well. I mean, when I learned French at school, I put learnt in inverted commas French at school many years ago. Our French teacher really didn't actually use any French at all. He attempted to teach us French through English, and very few French phrases were ever uttered at all in the class, and it was mainly grammar manipulation and translation. And that was an extreme example. And of course, pushing the first language, it was essentially a lesson that was conducted completely in English about French, and result, of course, very little learning went on. So we also, whoever does research, will need to define what we mean by using the first language, and that would mean quite a lot of analysis of what teachers do, whether they're using it just for managing classes, whether they're using it for psychological support, whether they're using it for translation of grammar or vocabulary, or anything in between that. Cherish, what's next for us?
Thanks, Chris. And I think, as you guys and Helen especially mentioned about the fact that there is no research based around this, which fits in very nicely to the next question, which is, what are the risks involved in translanguaging, and how could one handle that, if any?
Okay, I can take that. I mean, I think Chris has mentioned some of them, and I think the main risks are getting into trouble with the school director or the minister, who maybe have put in place a policy of one language only. And I think Chris explained nicely the approaches that can be taken there, in terms of openness and explaining that occasionally, and we're not saying do the whole lesson in the first language. We're not saying that at all. But there might be occasions when using the first language could be really useful. My daughter, she comes home with her French homework, and I speak French, and we do the homework, which is all in French. But then when there's certain grammatical questions that she has, I explain them to her in English, and that helps her to make those connections between what she already knows in English and what she then learns in French. And that way, and actually, I went to her parents' evening on Tuesday, and the teacher said she's really good at making connections between French, English, and Occitan. And she does that verbally in the classroom, and that is helping her to learn those languages because she's making those connections. And I think that's a key idea, is to make those connections. But coming back to the risks, I think it's getting into trouble, and that
Right.
you need to have you need to have a clear argument. You need to have a clear view of how it can be helpful before going ahead, basically.
Makes sense. Thank you so much, Helena. I've got another one here. It says, assuming teachers do come to accept translanguaging as a legitimate approach in ELT classroom, what will the guidelines be? How will teachers know how much L1 to use or allow? Will it be different for every ELT class group?
I think, well, I suppose it operates at two levels. I think we could probably agree general policies and general principles about when the first language may be used and when it's best to avoid it at that kind of macro level at the top. But then at micro level, I think teachers will need to use their discretion depending upon circumstances. As I say, if as a learner who is he's very anxious, he's very nervous, has needs some psychological support now, then now is the time to use the language. So, as I say, general principles will be separating using first language for classroom management, which I think is probably best avoided, because I do believe that the kind of routines of classroom management should be conducted in English. If they're going to be using it for contrastive work between the two languages, to say, well, actually, it's not like this, it's like that, which I think is a really effective intervention. Equally, if they're going to use it for translating vocabulary, simple vocabulary translations, or equally if they're going to use it, as I suggested before, for bringing complex concepts into class through text or through video or through whatever way, listening that would otherwise be beyond the English ability of the students. Conceptually, they can cope with it in their own language, but not linguistically. So I think we could have general principles, but ultimately, like much teaching, it's intuitive. Teachers have to have their toolbox and think, okay, this is the time for me to sit down with these guys for 5 minutes and speak to them in their own language, because they're not focused. Exams are coming. We need to have a serious grown-up talk, and because they're only I don't know, A2, I've got to do it in English. I've got to do it in their native language. So giving teachers the confidence to say, this is the moment to do this, or this is the moment to say, come on, you can do that in English. And being discretionary about it with individual students. We all have individual students who are just lazy, and they'll chat away in their own language, and you can say, come on, you can do this in English. All right. So I think it's that. I don't know what you think, Elena.
Absolutely. I think I think that was when you picked up on the word intuition there. I think you trust yourself. As teachers, those moments when you're trying and struggling to explain something in the target language, you're trying to do it in English, and you can see the look of confusion on the student's face, and they're not getting it, and it's just putting them further down into a hole. Those moments in your heart, oh, this is not helping them. So I think, just having, trusting your intuition, trusting yourself, as a teacher to know the moments when the first language could really work usefully as a tool to help those learners who are struggling. And I can see comments in the chat talking about, you know, is it more or less relevant with different level learners? I think yes, absolutely. You know, lower level learners, you have to draw on the first language because, you know, that you haven't got anything else to draw on when they just don't have that background knowledge of English at the beginning. Whereas, yes, with advanced level learners, you can struggle on more. They'll have more strategies for dealing with not knowing and have the vocabulary and ability to work things out. So trusting yourself.
Absolutely. I've just seen a question there about if there's, for example, a British teacher working in the Middle East who doesn't speak Arabic or very little Arabic, can they allow students to use Arabic? Can they almost trust students to use Arabic? I think you can. I think it's absolutely okay to say, okay, we're going to read this text. I've got your text in Arabic. Read it for 5 minutes, and then we'll talk about it in English. I think that's fine to say that you don't need to have the knowledge of the language at all. You know, I'm perfectly comfortable with that because I think, yeah, obviously, if they can't help necessarily with translations or with grammar comparisons, so if they are learning Arabic, they probably can. But I think you just have to trust students, and also, but we talked about delineation. Say, come on, okay, that's enough. Back to English, please. And I think if you've got your classroom management skills under control, you can do that.
And what about, Chris, if like they're discussing this amongst themselves in Arabic? So that's the same thing, like you said, like they're going to do that and then come back and discuss it in English. So amongst themselves, they're explaining to each other in Arabic.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't speak Arabic, you've absolutely no way of knowing what they're doing. But I think
Exactly.
you get a sense when a group are taking advantage of you. Basically, I think any teacher gets a sense of that. You know, intuition, all this stuff. We okay, they're not actually talking about the difference between the simple past and present perfect. They're talking about the football match tonight, aren't they? Okay, then come on, guys. We know that, I think, as teachers, we
know where to
get
strike that balance as teachers.
we know where to pull them in and when to let them go a little bit. But I think it is you know, after some work on grammar, or and they've done some activities, and you're seeing quite a lot of errors, it's okay to say, okay, why don't you just spend 2 or 3 minutes talking about this together? And the 2 or 3 students who are struggling, the other one can say, well, actually, you know, it works like this because, I've got it now. Problem solved. Fine. I'm very comfortable with that.
Thanks, Chris. And I hope, Rennie, that answers your question. Sorry, Helena, you were saying something.
No, I was just going to say we do that all the time, even at university level. You know, most of my students are from China, and sometimes we're talking about really complex concepts in applied linguistics. And so sometimes the students will just stop me and say, is it okay, teacher, if I just explain this to my friend in Mandarin? Yeah, go ahead. They explain. And then, you know, then we have a more fruitful conversation after that, because they've understood the basic concept in their own language, in their own words, in their own way. And then we can move forward, you know, and sometimes in the English language classroom, like as Chris was talking about with climate change, sometimes we're talking about concepts that, you know, can be challenging in the student's first language. So why not use the first language as a tool to help there?
Because if you give them a complex text and say, read this at home, they'll just go home and translate it anyway.
Yeah.
So let's facilitate that. It's much better off that they speak about it, to read it and speak about it together with you, and then you can start to draw the key concepts out and slide them across into English. Because I suppose they do it anyway. Perfectly normal, isn't it?
True. Thank you. I know we have 3 minutes left. Shall we take one last question then? Okay, so this one is, will translanguaging lead to a more acceptance of inclusivity?
I hope so.
Hope so, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Because as we were saying before, you know, language is such a personal thing. We construct our identity through language. So if we're denied our language in the classroom, we're denied ourselves, we're denied our own identity. So if we are accepting of who our students are, and language is a big part of who they are, then we're being more inclusive of who they are.
Absolutely, and also hopefully it will help to enhance the status of non-native speaking teachers. So there's another inclusivity element there. I mean, some parts of support for translanguagism are ideological, I suppose, in some sense. But a lot of teaching is ideological, and I'm good with that. I think we need to. English language teaching is rather an inward-looking profession anyway, the best of times. I think looking out and into the big bad world is something that we should be doing. And yeah, absolutely. And respecting people's first language is very much part of that.
I mean, English is so dominant in the world, and we have to recognize where that dominance has come from, and we shouldn't always be reinforcing that. We need to, there's such a hierarchy with languages. Which isn't healthy. So including and being inclusive and accepting of all languages in the classroom is a much more equal and inclusive way of doing things, and is challenging this hierarchy of languages that does exist in our world.
Absolutely, I agree.
True. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Just conscious of your time, and I know there's another question that has popped in. But we're just the end of the time, and we just had an hour dedicated for this session, and lots of thank you. So I do want to extend that to Helena and Christopher. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. Thank you
for the session. This was a very interesting topic for me too. So I learned a lot from you guys.
Thanks, Suresh.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. You will have the recording of the session via email. And those of you attending the webinar will also be receiving a certificate in your inbox. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your week. See you next time.
Thank you. Cheers. Thank you. Bye-bye.